link on the event finder or service that AR is providing, I think is different than the link that we're using. So if you have any colleagues maybe emailing or texting you that they can't find the room, that could be a reason. And so we're trying to get them from that. But I think most are here now. So we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon or good morning, wherever you might be. My name is Axel Takach, and I'm honored and delighted to open this conversation and book launch sponsored by the Association of Interreligious Interfaith Studies and the Journal of Interreligious Studies, for which I am the current editor-in-chief, the fourth person to hold that title since its founding as the Journal of Interreligious Dialogue in 2009. In early 2014, the journal changed its name to the Journal of Interreligious Studies, reflecting the emerging and rapidly changing discipline of interreligious studies and coinciding also with the creation of the Interreligious and Interfaith Studies group at the American Academy of Religion. Now, it was in late 2016 when I became its current editor-in-chief and have been thrilled and humbled to work with the fantastic editorial, publishing, and research teams at Hebrew College, Boston University School of Theology, and Hartford Seminary as well. Also, this is sort of a testament to how their journal is growing and we're growing in partnerships. And also one of the strategies that the journal takes in sort of continuing to thrive as it makes partnerships with various institutions. The journal was originally a creation of two graduate students. I think many of you know this story, but I think it's worth always recalling how it happened, right? Stephanie Varnian Hughes was at Union Theological Seminary. Rabbi Joshua Stanton was attending rabbinical school in Jerusalem. And at the time, as they tell it, and as they've told me, and I've heard often, they were assessing the resources. They were assessing the resources available to them, and there seemed to be a dearth of journals in the libraries of religious and theological studies that were dedicated directly and explicitly to interreligious work. At the same time, they noticed an increasing number of graduate students and younger scholars working at the intersection of multiple religions, some doing so confessionally, others doing so non-confessionally. They weren't doing comparative religion exactly, and they weren't doing comparative theology exactly. They weren't necessarily in the field of religious studies proper, focusing, for example, on area studies or on textual, historical, and theological work. Some were involved directly in interreligious dialogue, that's true, and others were engaged more behind the scenes in analyzing what was taking place in their own or in other contexts. I think the point is that these younger scholars all shared commitment to working in more than one religious tradition and working on questions of public significance at the interfaces between and among religious traditions and communities, especially. It was a sort of liminal space involving comparative works and ecumenical questions, a mix of dialogue and scholarship, and sometimes theology, and sometimes a study of religion, featuring a mix of confessional and academic and activist approaches. But at this time, in 2009, it seemed there was a gap, at least in the North American context. For example, where could an interfaith community organizer publish an academic reflection on their own work in the field as a scholar practitioner or as an activist theologian? Where could a scholar publish theories and methods of interreligious engagement, dialogue or justice work, or analyses of interreligious conflicts? Where was there a venue to publish all of this research, all this analysis, and careful reflections? The journal sought to be that venue, a venue to publish articles considering what's happening in the interreligious and interfaith community and institutions, articles considering what works, what doesn't work, and so forth. Interreligious studies itself was imagined as a sort of interdisciplinary field, and so the journal aimed to be a conduit for publishing and communicating what was going on in that field. More than a decade after its founding, the journal remains a rich resource for scholars of interreligious studies. I think I should repeat that. More than a decade after its founding. That's really cool. And so on, from activists to scholars and everyone in between. Much has changed since 2009, right? Politically, socially, religiously. But sort of what I also write in the introduction of the book, right, is that the timeliness of interreligious studies remains precisely because deep understanding in divisive times is a timeless necessity. Crossing through, dwelling within, and even moving against those boundaries facilitates the creative and sort of transformation of individuals, societies, communities, and the globe. The journal has expanded significantly since 2009, Hebrew College, Boston University School of Theology, and now Hartford Seminary are co-publishers and sponsors of the journal's work. And we have our first print publication, Deep Understanding in Divisive Times, um, which we celebrate here today. We have partnered with various institutions and organizations to publish special issues. Today, we can also officially celebrate the production of the first episode of our new podcast, Intersections, which we have produced in partnership with Seton Hall University's Institute for Communication and Religion. I'm a faculty member at Seton Hall, so I work with them to get this podcast, which is going to feature conversations about the field and spotlight ideas and practices of interfaith and interreligious scholars, educators, leaders, and community organizers. In the first episode, interviews Rabbi Or Rose, Dr. Stephanie Varnon-Hughes, and Rabbi Joshua Stanton, and is also available on our website, and I'll be sending out an official announcement about the podcast soon. The field of interreligious studies is uniquely situated to analyze and learn from the fraught nature of marked boundaries that unite and divide. And so our first published volume urges scholars, practitioners, and scholar practitioners to cross those boundaries and enter deeply into the experience of other religious communities and traditions, in this case. No moment in history is more or less in need of deep understanding in divisive times, even if any given moment is different, right? And this is why we thought this volume is most important to publish. So let me now, to conclude, I'm very glad everyone's here, and I want to introduce now Russ Arnold, who is an associate professor of religious studies at Regis University in Denver, Colorado, and teaches courses in interfaith studies, biblical studies, and Jewish studies. Since moving to Regis, he's been active in interfaith dialogue and building strong relations between Regis and local Muslim and Jewish communities. And additionally, he serves in the leadership team for the Association of Interreligious Interfaith Studies, a co-sponsor of this celebratory event. Thank you. Go ahead, Russ.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to see this come together. We first started talking about this as an in-person event almost a year ago now, maybe, and so much has changed, as we all know, but it's a pleasure to participate in this together. So let me just introduce the association a little bit. As Axel said, I've been leading the Association for Interreligious Interfaith Studies. The association was launched in 2017 at the AAR meeting in Boston, founded by Jenny Peace, who at the time also chaired the AAR section on interreligious and interfaith studies. The association was formed to provide open, collegial conversational spaces to support the development of the field of interreligious and interfaith studies. As we all know, this field, rushing through its infancy into adolescence, maybe, I don't know, we may all have different sense of what stage of development we are, but institutionally, I think in the early kind of development, we recognize that we continue to need opportunities for conversation and collaboration beyond the limited panel structures of AAR. Each year since 2017, the association has hosted annual meetings on the Friday before AAR to explore the particularities of local interfaith organizations, the experience of emerging scholars in the field, and a range of other topics brought up by participants at these sessions. We particularly focused on giving over a good amount of time for the participants in the room to raise questions and gather people around them to ask or to engage in conversation with each other about things that are pressing on our minds in our scholarship, in our teaching, and in our work. We've been greatly helped in this work by our collaboration with the Journal of Interreligious Studies and the European Society for Intercultural Theology and Interreligious Studies, ACETUS. Our goal is that the association will serve as a nexus of coordination, collaboration, and innovation in scholarship, teaching, and community engagement in relation to the variety of individuals, institutions, and organizations who are working to build this field. For example, Interfaith Youth Corps, Pluralism Project, Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, Parliament of the World's Religions, many, many others. The association also supports a group of emerging scholars facilitated by Rachel Heath, those pursuing graduate degrees or recently graduated and serving as junior faculty, to foster collaboration and support in making their way. This has been an important part of the work of the association, to try to identify and bring together emerging scholars who can support each other and then be supported by the network of the association. The leadership team of the association is in the process of formalizing our organization, developing its mission and vision and bylaws and membership processes. With the help of Soren Hessler of Drew University, we've just launched a website, which I'll put the link in the chat there, aiistudies.org, where you can find more information and a link to contact us if you're interested in joining the leadership team or participating in the growth of the association. I hope you'll feel free to contact me if you have any questions about the association, as we're building it together and continuing the partnership with the journal, which we're really happy about. So with that, let me turn over to Rachel Mikva, who is the Herman Schallman Chair in Jewish Studies at Chicago Theological Seminary and co-chair of the AAR section on Interreligious and Interfaith Studies, to introduce our first panel.
Hi, it's wonderful to be with all of you. I'm very excited to introduce the folks on this panel. We recognize that there is a deep need for dialogue and understanding across religious difference, but we also know that there are times that we feel the priority is to resist certain religious claims that we feel are harmful. So our panel is going to focus on various dimensions of this tension. And we have an amazing group. So let me tell you a little bit about them and then we'll just jump in. Paula Green is the founder of Karuna Center for Peace Building and also Professor Emerita at the School for International Training Graduate Institute. She's won many awards, including being honored by the Dalai Lama as an unsung hero of compassion. Allison K. Ralph is the Assistant Director of the Inclusive America Project at the Aspen Institute and a scholar of history and religion with special interest in societal boundaries, publishing on religion, history, society, rhetoric, and justification of coercion in the social body. She's editor of the recent volume, Pluralism in Peril, Challenges to an American Ideal, which addresses how our nation can maintain its historical commitment to embracing people of all faith backgrounds against a backdrop of polarization. Luis Menendez-Santuña is Assistant Professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology, and his work focuses on liberation theologies, cultural studies, and critical theory. His first monograph on Revelation is called Thinking Sex with the Great Whore, Deviant Sexualities and Empire in the Book of Revelation. Offers an emancipatory reading of Revelation 17 and 18, using post-colonial and queer historiographies to explore emancipatory paths for identity formation in biblical texts. And Funlayo E. Wood Menzies is a scholar practitioner of Africana religions, spiritual counselor, and facilitator. Her work also focuses on women and gender relations, indigenous knowledge and healing systems, and intersections between religion and technology. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Black Studies Research at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her manuscript in progress is entitled Obi, Death, Divination, and the Divine Feminine. It will be the first book-length study of the Kolana, the Obi, in the context of Yoruba indigenous religion. So with this amazing group, I'm just going to throw a question out there and hope that our panelists will jump in. And if not, I'll start picking on people. But I know they have a lot to contribute. So I would actually like to start by asking you to share a recent example from your work that required navigating these impulses and needs between trying to nurture dialogue and understanding, but also contesting dangerous ideas and religious claims. Nobody's going to jump in?
I was trying to talk, we can't.
Oh, I think, are you able to hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. There at least has to be one "can you hear me now" moment in a Zoom, or it's not official, right? So good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here, to be a part of this panel. I want to personally thank Axel for inviting me, and also for just always thinking of me in the spirit of collaboration. I've been a long time supporter and contributor to the journal, and I used to write for State of Formation, and I've really been involved throughout the life of all of this. So I'm really happy to see all of the levels that it's grown to, and to now be on the board of advisors as well. When I saw this question, it intrigued me and interested me deeply, because really, as a scholar of African religions and indigenous religions, my entire career is this tension, right, between contesting the very dangerous rhetoric that often surrounds these traditions, both in terms of their knowledge systems as well as their practitioners themselves, and then also trying to bridge these gaps and be a part of spaces like this, where we also create connections between ourselves and other communities. And this tension is definitely very real, and it's heavier for some communities than others. And I would say that, in terms of African and other indigenous traditions, we have to necessarily kind of err on the side of contesting harmful claims, because there have been so many made that are still in circulation. There are so many ways that African and indigenous traditions are still disrespected in popular culture, in almost every arena. They're one, whereas other traditions have gained a level of respect. And I would say, certainly over time, African and indigenous traditions have gained a level of respect. There's still a lot of work to be done in that arena. And so it is often difficult to balance the desire to connect, but also to ensure that our epistemologies, our cultural products, our spiritual views are respected in their own right, without necessarily having to be compared or aligned with another system. And so it's definitely a tension that I deal with often. I would say, as far as a concrete example, one thing that has recently happened in a beautiful way to try to bridge these gaps is my mother and I recently started a podcast. She is a Baptist reverend, and I, as was mentioned, am a priestess of Orisha. And so we speak very candidly about all of these things, with her as a Christian, and both of us being African American, but coming from these two different traditions that have two very different histories within the African American community. Having this dialogue and being very candid about it publicly has been really beautiful, because many people of different backgrounds and different religious traditions have been able to come to us after, and have said, hearing you all speak about this tension between, pushing back against some of the claims, for example, that Christianity has made against African religion, but also recognizing the ways that the Black church has been an anchor in African American community, and how this dialogue is important. And that's been a really big wonderful gateway into soothing some of that tension.
Thanks.
My response was kind of different because my work is quite different. I was invited to this panel through OR because I had asked OR a year or two ago to be a speaker at a Jewish-Muslim dialogue that I was co-facilitating in Amherst area where I live. And so he thought about me as doing religiously based dialogue. However, I have been doing dialogue around the world for 30 or 40 years, and all religions enter it, but it's not necessarily called religious dialogue. It's called sometimes called interfaith, but sometimes interethnic or international or intergroup. And we should probably use Thich Nhat Hanh's phrase interbeing and cover all of it, but but that's the way it's phrased. And my role as a facilitator or even a facilitative educator is not so much for me to confront someone for ideas that seem radically exclusive or radically dangerous, but to create the context in a group setting where either it doesn't come up or it comes up and the group members respond to it, so that I am able to stay in my facilitator seat where I am there to help people bridge the divides, build understanding and empathy, and feel safe enough to be able to speak deeply about what's in their hearts. And if I become the arbiter around the issues that come up, I lose that capacity, and then I'm doing something else. But I very much trust the group process, and somebody in the group will say what I'm feeling. It's there. It's just a matter of who identifies it and how it's done. And you know, I've worked in India with Hindus and Muslims, and in Sri Lanka with Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, and Christians, and the same in Myanmar, which has gotten so bad that Muslim citizens are being denied citizenship. And they're kind of at the bottom of a heap there. I've worked with Jews, Muslims, and Christians in the Mideast for 25, 30 years, with Orthodox Christians, Catholic, and Muslims in Bosnia. And there are many cases like North Ireland or Russia and Georgia where everyone's the same religion. And oftentimes the media wants to blame religion as the cause of the conflict. It's easy, it's quick, it's one word, and it's completely wrong. But people come to my training programs and my graduate schools were believing that that's the case. And so we have to unpack that and look at what the true sources are. And after 2016, I started a project in the United States called Hands Across the Hills. You can go to the website. It's become quite well known and it's gotten a lot of media attention. And it's between residents of Massachusetts and residents of Kentucky. And those are two vastly different universes. And the differences include religion, but are not specifically about religion. Nonetheless, in our opening event, we had two women from Massachusetts talk about Holocaust tragedies in their family that just blew the minds of the Kentuckians who didn't know the history at all, believe it or not. It was not taught in their schools. Didn't understand what any of this was about. So religion is always omnipresent in everything that we do. And it's such a deep source of identity to people that no matter what we're talking about, there's a defensiveness around it because religion has provided all sorts of meaning and shelter and comfort and safety in the slings and arrows of harsh lives. So people are very involved in it, and they are quick to respond to others who will do what the question is asking, who will talk about very pejorative comments about other religions. Sometimes even the best of facilitators slip and forget. And when I was doing this dialogue with the Kentuckians, I found myself around political issues, having a very hard time staying in that seat. And I want to tell you a story about Bosnia, where the participants in my groups, I worked there for many, many years, were Serbs who were Orthodox Christian and Muslims who didn't have another name. They now call themselves Bosniaks instead. And the Serbs in the room lived in a city where the first concentration camps of the Bosnian War had been discovered. And some of the Muslims in the room had been in those camps. But when we started the dialogues, this was 2 years after the genocide, the Serbs were in complete denial of the existence of these camps. 100% denial. You know, defenses defend, and people need defenses until they can take them down. And they were very caught up in them. And the Muslims actually couldn't stay in the room around that. That was sort of walkout material for them. You know, I was tortured there, and my brother was killed there, and you're telling me they don't exist. And I found that I didn't want to fight back because that's really counterproductive in a dialogue. But what I was able to do was to stand in solidarity with the Muslim participants and hold them. So to hold the side that was struggling around this issue until the other side could finally, 3 years later or so, begin to acknowledge what had happened. And they couldn't do it sooner because there was no psychological capacity for them at that point to talk about what had been done in the name of their identity and religious groups. So sometimes what I want to say in summary is that one can find ways around being the confronter while making sure that the confrontation and the care happens.
Thanks, Paula. Allison or Luis, you want to jump in?
Sure. When I thank you everyone for to the committee for inviting me to be here. It's such an honor. So my job basically requires me to teach Christian New Testament texts. I teach New Testament basically, which means that I will teach courses on Paul, on the Gospels. And when I received this question, two things came to mind. The first one is kind of obvious, and I think that most New Testament professors have to deal with it, which is that when we study the texts, right, in class, students first come to it as well. We're gonna study this text in the first century from a neutral perspective. And what always comes about is that the student identify with the text in very different ways depending on their religious affiliations. So what it happens, it will be that Christian students, mostly I have taught in Protestant seminaries, and now I teach at the Methodist school, but I'm also Catholic, and I have seen that those dynamics happening in Catholicism, is that it's like Christian students will identify with the Christian side, being Paul or Jesus, right? As the holders of the Christian truth, and will be this idea of Christianity versus Judaism, right? Christianity as this has become kind of a trope and also a truism, but you still see it today. Like students see this Christianity as overcoming a legalistic, earthy, found on law religion that is Judaism. And then comes Jesus, the liberator, who overcomes Judaism with all these moral views on being yourself and the love of God. And so this pitting of one religion against the other, whereby one identifies with the second term of the equation, being Christianity, ends up chastising Judaism as this religion of the past and based on legalism, right? So that's one thing that comes to mind immediately. But another thing that happens is that students that don't identify within a Christian tradition will identify with the pagans in Paul, for example, right? So that's one thing that where like the identity of the Christian text in the first century maps onto our identities in the present. And one thing in which I've found that it's useful to address those contemporary religious and theological claims is by doing just good history, right? Good history shows that that's actually not the case. And one way in which we, at least in New Testament studies, we address that is by crafting a careful curriculum or syllabus design where you study Paul from a Jewish perspective, or like you include Jewish views of readings, contemporary Jewish readings of Jesus or the Gospels. So that's on a very basic level. But I think what is more interesting to me, or more pervasive, if you will, because it's harder to address, is that students will or we all come to the table with ideas of subjectivity, agency, um, relationship with the community, even relationship with the earth, that are based on traditions that are really hard to give up, but have theological connotations. I think I talked this in my contribution to the volume, but like just to give you an example, many of the students are particularly interested in exploring how women in the first century would understand their religious identity, and how Paul, the apostle, conceptualized that religious identity. And what usually comes to the fore is this idea that women can only be free if they are liberal agents, right? But this is an idea of religion that only comes or belongs particularly explicitly to Protestantism and Catholicism, and dismisses the experience of millions of women in other religions who understand their agency in completely different terms, right? So that's actually a subtext that is really hard to navigate, and that's where, if in the first case history did the work, in this case historical or critical theory is where one has to do the job, right? So like what I will try to do is to bring to the table different notions of agency as theorized by particularly Muslim women and Jewish women.
Thanks. Allison?
Yeah, thank you so much. And just to reiterate what others have already said, what a joy and honor it is to be with all of you amazing humans today. As Rachel said at the start, I'm the assistant director of the Inclusive America Project, and we have I'm trying mostly to do practical work in the world, and that means that we're trying to build a nation in which everyone has the rights, freedoms, and safety to worship or not according to their conscience. It's huge and systemic and wild, woolly work. It's entirely impossible, and it's good fun. And getting to that future vision will require systemic change across many different interdependent systems of work, such as religious freedom, religious literacy, hate crime prevention, and others. And those are ideals that are often, but not exclusively, associated with liberal agendas. And lots of us, I'll include myself as an individual, not as a professional in that category, but some of us on the liberal end will argue that we will never see real change unless we throw all of it out and start over. Some people insist that the changes that are asked for or called for are unreasonable or dangerous to our society. And at IAP, at the Inclusive America Project, we see that dichotomy itself as problematic. The either or of that is problematic because it plays into that narrative of polarization, as though there are only two sides of any particular question, when, as all of our traditions tell us, humanity is incredibly complex as cultures and peoples and individuals. Not one single one of us lives lives free of complicity in one or more systems of oppression. Obviously, some of us are more complicit than others, but we are still human. We are deeply flawed and ever failing. And at the same time, we are also allies with each other. We're feeding our neighbors and responding to crises and bearing each other up. We are always both complicit and also have at least the potential to do great good. So at IAP, we try to stay away from that binary of either or and find different ways to articulate our failings and our gifts, frankly. And so what we try to do is find areas of shared concern that draw people away from that terminology of battle lines and away from the terminology of the either or. And so one example of our work in that way is with Inclusive America Project fellow Asma Tiyuddin. She is a Muslim lawyer who was among the lawyers who won the Hobby Lobby case for the Green family. That meant that they did not have to provide all of the birth control that the ACA wanted them to provide. So Asma's project is called the Politics of Vulnerability Project. We recently published a report. You can find it on our website. That project connects mostly conservative white evangelicals and Muslims of lots of stripes together around the shared concerns of religious freedom and other things like the rise of secularism. Those are both issues of concern for both sets of communities. And around those issues, these apparently very divergent and publicly headbutting communities can build real trust and a common understanding. And that just totally explodes the binary, the us-them binary, and ultimately helps to protect the religious liberty to worship or not according to our conscience for every single one of us.
Well, thank you all so much for your thoughtful and very different reflections around that. One of the way it manifests in my world, existing in a historically Protestant and increasingly multi-faith, but progressive, religiously and politically progressive seminary, is, when engaging with people more religiously traditional, never mind the politics, there are issues around LGBTQ issues or certain kinds of religious freedom claims that are considered harmful to other people. And so there are tensions around there. And one of my friends who's an evangelical Christian said, we can't always be the problem. Sometimes we have to be the religious other with whom you're engaging. And so there is work around that too. And so in my seminary, we talk about when we encounter ideas that we consider dangerous, whether it be claims of exclusivity or claims around LGBTQ identity or other kinds of claims that we find problematic, and we're engaging with somebody, how do you call them in, right? Rather than just fighting with them, how can you invite them? What are some of your go-to practices, strategies for when you meet an idea that makes you want to yell and scream, or at least resist it, right? That's the title of Dialogue and Resistance. What are your go-to strategies for calling them into conversation to perhaps at least understand a different perspective? Or when you do feel obliged to call them out, what are your best practices for critiquing religious ideas that are in your dialogue space or in the public square?
In this Hands Across the Hills project that I've been working on with Kentucky and Massachusetts over the years, the politics are really volatilely divergent, and we had long dialogues. I have experience with working multi-days with people because I've been doing it overseas so much. And we had 3 days at a time, either in Kentucky or Massachusetts over the past couple of years. We're still doing it. And we learned to really separate out the passionate politics of passionate religious claims from the person. And it's made all the difference in the world. You always, when you're learning about teaching, you learn that you don't attack the student, you attack the problem. You deal with the problem, not with the individual. And I think we forget that in the polarizations in our country around religion and the various claims that are being made in its name. And what we've learned to do is we've had so much experience with the full humanity of the other that what we do is go back to that full humanity so that we're not caught up in the differences. And people see each other in in that fullness and respect each other in that fullness. And respect is such an important word. You know, I don't think we realize how important respect and dignity are. People will fight and kill if they're dissed. We know that. And when people feel the respect from the group and the safety, I find they're much more likely to refrain from the attack mode, because the attack mode is based on fear and it's defending something. So I try to get my groups to the place where people are able to speak from a centered place because they are being held and respected. And they don't have to fight for attention. They don't have to fight for being right, because you're being given plenty of support to allow them to be that. And I've been running for the past 20 years at the School for International Training, a summer training program for 60 people from around the world each summer in Vermont, and then each winter in South Asia, people who have lived through conflict. And there's probably hardly anybody more damaged and coming in with more difficulty. But we've also learned there to dive deeply enough so that we're experiencing the fullness of each of these individuals. Every religion in the world is there, every race, every conflict, every language, etc. And I don't find our people, the more they get to know each other, the less they need calling out, because it drops as the respect and the kindness and the compassion, the empathy for each other's life stories increases. And so for me, that's one of the ways that I do it. And as a facilitator, as I said earlier, it's not my role to call people out. It's my role to blow the whistle on destructive speech. But we do that in the dialogue format, as you all know, by agreeing to guidelines in the beginning. And when people begin to yell at each other inappropriately or say the wrong things, I go back to the guidelines and let that be the way that people are able to come back into line. So that's a start to your answer.
Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you for that, Paula. I would agree as well that respect is such a key ingredient in both the calling in and calling out, as well as creating spaces for dialogue. And so that has really been one of the biggest parts of my work in terms of, I'm the founder of the African and Diasporic Religious Studies Association. And a part of founding that organization was to create space for practitioners of different African and Indigenous traditions, which are often seen as monolithic, but which have many different points of variation and contention and ideologies around various things, including racial issues, LGBT issues, and all of these things. So I create a lot of space for dialogue in between these communities to ensure that we're able to talk about these things from a passionate place, but also from, as our brother Louis said, from that space of history, from the space of facts, from the space of presenting, look, this is actually how things occurred, and this is why things are as they are, which many times people don't even recognize the historical processes that took place to get us to where we are. We hold every truth that we hold to be self-evident and to be the one. And so even kind of breaking that down a little bit and saying, listen, 300 years ago, your people didn't do that or didn't think that way, or 1,000 years ago, or here's what the practice was then, and here's what it is now, and here's why. So really creating that space for the scholarly study of African and Indigenous traditions in particular has been really, really important to presenting that dialogue between communities and then also out to the greater interreligious community. And in terms of calling out, I would say the same thing in terms of, the scholarship really being a bit of an anchor. And again, starting from that place of respect, because Indigenous traditions, by and large, don't make grand claims to truth, right? They make the whole point of Indigenous traditions is connection. is balance, is respecting the natural world, is respecting one another. One of the biggest things that happens between Indigenous people when they enter each other's spaces is they ask one another, what is sacred here? Right? Show me what's sacred. Show me what your divine looks like. Show me where I can and cannot go. Show me what your boundaries are. I'm not going to assume that they're the same as mine. And so starting from that place, I as well travel a lot around the world and actually participate in ceremonies with different communities and bring that back to my community. And so I practice Reiki. I've done Temazcal ceremonies with Indigenous people in Mexico, ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru, and really been able to come back and speak to bigger communities about what the connections are that maybe sometimes we don't see. That the same idea of submitting to the divine, for example, that's in Islam, is also in African Indigenous spirituality, just expressed differently with the idea of spirit possession. That's also a submission of oneself, right? So being able to really bridge these ideas and show those common features, as well as creating spaces for dialogue, I think is one of the most important aspects of both calling in and calling out.
Thanks, Lyle.
I love that, and I would like to elaborate a bit more on it regarding my context. And actually taking up Rachel's initial topic on the question of LGBTQI, right? So I self-identify as queer, and one of the things that I find particularly interesting when teaching New Testament is that well, like the positions are polarized, right? But one strategy that I find particularly helpful, or at least has been very helpful in my context, is to follow a genealogical approach, which is not so much to try to come to a conclusion about what position is best, but try to reflect on how this question becomes so important, right? How the question, for example, of the LGBTQ acceptance, regardless of the answers that you're going to give to it, has become the litmus test to define your religious commitments.
Especially since the text has a lot more to say about other things.
Right. And we usually find out is that once we start excavating the answer to this question, it has little to do with the topic itself, right? It has more to do with how we are invested in portraying other traditions as less than us, or as being caught up in time, or all those kind of questions. So I realize that the genealogical approach does not solve the question, but it does allow us to start considering how these questions have become our identity questions and in such defining moments.
Thank you.
Love that you, several of you have spoken about the full humanity of each of us and how important that is in this work. And thinking about this question, I was thinking, the language of in and out, the calling in and out, still presents that binary, as though there's only one or the other that you can be in or out. And I said, before, we are all complicit to various degrees in all sorts of atrocities. But I think, although it's easy to despair with that isn't a reason to give up and go home. We see that as a reason to see the divine spark, or the imago Dei, or humanity, or however our various traditions phrase that, and each one of us. In my personal life, when I have an opportunity for calling out or in, I start with my own failings. And here's an example. When my Unitarian Universalist congregation was beginning to discuss adopting the explicitly anti-racist guiding principle that has kind of been circling around our denomination for a while, And our own congregation was really struggling with doing that. I offered a lay sermon starting with an admission of what I call the cobwebs of racism in my raised in the Southern U.S. brain, and the admission that I am still learning to acknowledge those cobwebs and just learning how to sweep them aside. So by acknowledging my personal failings first and then showing to my congregation, yes, we are failing, flawed human beings, there's also a way forward, that then showed some members of my congregation that you don't have to be stopped dead by the shame of that in fact you have to acknowledge that. And some of our traditions might call that confession in order to reconcile and to be able to find a way to move forward. But because there were those individuals who were stuck in that shame and were afraid of that confession, we were stuck as a congregation. And I'll say that to acknowledge, those failings first is frankly terrifying. It opens that acknowledgement here on this national stage with all of you incredibly intelligent, wonderful human beings. That opens me to being called out by any one of you for the racism that is cobwebbed in my brain, since I've just admitted that so publicly. And that is totally terrifying, right? I mean, it gives me butterflies in my stomach and brings tears to my eyes and all of that good stuff. But what that does is acknowledge that acknowledgement of failure on a personal level is now a bridge to every single other human being out there who has also failed. And
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, it just cuts that defensiveness. And so that strategy can really push, can allow a significant change in the dialogue.
I always gave my High Holy Day sermon. One was always devoted to a sin. It always had to be a sin that I committed so I could talk about it in that way, because I do think that. I agree, but I do recognize at the same time, of course, that power relationships shape how safe it is to be vulnerable in that way, and we can't ignore those in engagements around difference. So time's a little short, so we had a couple other questions that we previewed to you. I'm going to combine them and ask you to speak once more. We're interested in thinking about how the field of interreligious studies, especially strategies for dialogue and the history of interreligious confrontation too, right? Recognizing that we've done it badly around history many times before. What might we be able to draw from it to illuminate this particular moment in which the political polarization is so enormous? And you've touched upon it in little ways. And if you could think a little more about that and share, if you can, a little bit about what you've learned about yourself in this work. So kind of combine those and ask you to go around one more time.
I'm guessing that we all learn so much about ourselves that the outcome is humility. It's just, our minds are so complicated. There's so much to learn from everybody. And our stereotypes are so deep inside of us, so unacknowledged, unconscious. And all of those keep getting challenged in this work because we keep finding the multi-dimensions of each human in their total full humanity. And we don't know that about people because we don't generally operate that way outside of the context of these intimate settings like interreligious dialogues or just plain religious dialogues. And it's such a gift because it's such an opportunity for expansion, for self-understanding, for growth that I don't think I would have accessed in ordinary ways. And that's precious, and that creates inner transformation. And we don't get to transforming our society and our communities if we're not doing the inner work ourselves. And if we are, there are ways in which that's evident and comes up. And I liked what was being said before about finding those liminal places that are neither this nor that. We're still stuck in binaries, polarities, and how do you get the doubts in? How do you get people to ask the questions of what if, or where there are shades of gray, in your life and your thinking, so that we move away from the boxed in thinking of I'm this and you're that, and there's no middle ground. And it's a very precious place to help get ourselves to. And when we get there, there's something important for me about acknowledging that we're different. We're not looking for sameness here. Acknowledging the difference, but finding the commonalities where we can serve and act together. Because that's what our world needs now. Our world is hurting so profoundly here and around the world from polarizations. And unless we learn to identify and jump on that common ground from the full complexity of each human being, we don't get very far. And after the acknowledgements, there's apology. And when that can happen in a circle, you're on holy ground, and you can feel the tensions dissolve and some other force come in, because we crave that and we need it for ourselves, and we give it to others so infrequently. And I think it would help in this country around the political, religious, social tensions we're feeling now, to begin much more with a self responsibility, apology, and acknowledgement, offering it rather than pushing on other people for them to change. I think it would make a tremendous difference. And Mother Teresa had this wonderful phrase that I use a lot in my teaching. She said, "The trouble with human beings is we make our circles too small." And I work physically on this with my students and say, take this and open it up and open it up again and open it up again, and see if you can get to the point where there really is an open arm for everyone. And that shift of consciousness, I think, is where true transformation of our planet lies.
Thank you, Paula.
Well, once again, I absolutely agree. I think that, that embrace is so important, and humility. From the Ifa tradition, we say no one knows the beginning and the end of all things. And so that's one of our very first acknowledgements, is the fact that we are never the holders of all truth, that everything is from various perspectives, and that whether things look black or white can sometimes depend on what side you're standing. And so that very real, in terms of what I've learned about myself, is really just how much I love people and humanity, and in particular, the communities in which I engage, and how important it is to me to do much more of the calling in work, and really inviting connection, inviting dialogue, inviting building, particularly in the climate. I won't even say the current climate, because it's really been the climate all along, but it's been brought to our attention a lot more recently in terms of race and some of those conflicts. And I found myself really saying no more than yes to engaging with those conversations, because for me, one of the things that I've learned about myself is that, and about this process, is that you sometimes have to make peace with letting certain aspects of dialogue go, and really focusing your attention where you feel the most impact will be made. And so for me, I've found that it's very, very important to me to facilitate this intra-religious dialogue within my own community, more so than anything else, and to really ensure that at least we understand each other, because we can't present ourselves out to a larger society and larger communities if we're having battles internally. And of course, this is an issue that goes on in all religious communities, but there has been less sort of time and attention and energy devoted to bringing
I'm registered under you
together. So that's one big takeaway for me, and I really look
Try it now, Carol.
Continuing the dialogue together.
Thanks, Funlayo.
So as Funlayo said, I'm not sure that these are more divisive times than previous times. So I'm a bit suspicious of that rhetoric of thinking of the current times as especially divisive. I do think they're divisive in a special way, but I don't think they're particularly more divisive than 19th century colonialism or 16th century slavery, right? So one of the things that I have learned, particularly in my conversations with other religious activists, it's how what I think is important or what I have learned that is important in the current interreligious dialogue, and I have learned from particularly from my activist friends, is one of the characteristics of these times that are divisive is how the public space has been more and more circumscribed to the limits of capitalism, right? Everything has become mercantilized. So even the public space and the public square has become particularly hard to navigate because it's instrumentalized for economic purposes. So I do think that one of the beautiful things that I have learned in the interreligious dialogue is how do we come together, not always to talk about religious differences, but to talk about the space that allow us to talk about religious differences.
Thank you. Allison, you want to jump in one more time?
Yeah, just briefly. I think Sunlaya, you said something a minute ago about understanding. This wasn't your language, but understanding what your call is. That you need to do more of this and less of that. And I think that's a big part of what we can learn is that we don't all have to have the same mission and or the same call, the same vocation. And in fact, we actually need, because this mess is such a mess that we need the fact that our traditions and our different missions and visions approach personal and collective failure differently, approach sin differently. We need different kinds of theologians who have different visions for the future. We need theologians to argue, seriously and critically with each other to try to create and envision something better and improve their different theologies. We need different kinds of confessors and different kinds of balm for the soul, all of that stuff. And that's exactly why at the Inclusive America Project, we're building a national network of local and national civic and faith leaders called the Powering Pluralism Network. And these are folks of all stripes, faith and civic leaders, academic funders, basically anyone working in any of the fields of religious pluralism. And this group does not necessarily agree on moral, ethical, policy, or social issues or any of it, but I think the thing that ties them together is that they understand that they need each other and that they need each other to have their very different and very divergent missions and calls as we collectively try to build that vision of a truly pluralistic future.
Right, the dialectical tension does not necessarily mean dichotomy, right? We actually help to establish each other in the public square and conversation across different.
That's exactly right.
So thank you all so much for making time to be part of this conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to our hosts I think we're going to break into small groups and have a chance for conversation together.
Yes, thank you, Rachel, and thank you to all of our panelists. This has been wonderful. So we're going to, I don't know how to shift back into speaker mode. Hold on a sec. We're going to move into breakout rooms briefly. We have, technically it's till 2:20. We're going to plan to come back at 2:30 all together for the second panel. But before, we've created a Google Doc shared document link that I'm putting in the chat right now that people can share back from their breakout rooms. And then the questions we have some sample, or just the questions that were shared with the panelists. I'm going to put in the chat as well if you want to use those as guiding questions for your conversations. And again, I'll give people a announcement at 2:20 and bring us back together by 2:30 for the main conversation. You can either keep talking or take a break between 2:20 and 2:30. So thank you, everyone, and I'll open the rooms now.
I think he just arrived. It's really, really wonderful to be here with all of you, to see familiar faces and new folks. You know, I'm grateful for everyone who was able to attend and for all the folks who organized this. Nobody's held up this book to do that like little pitch moment yet, so I'm gonna do that because I just received my copy and it's just a wonderful collection. Not being one of the editors, I feel I can say that unabashedly. It's well organized. There's a lot of really thoughtful pieces in here. I think it's a great reflection of some of the breadth and depth, frankly, of the last 10 years of the journal. And so I really commend Lucinda, Axel, Orr, Mary Elizabeth, and I know Tom had a big hand. So just very appreciative to both read the contributions of so many of you and to have been asked to participate in contributing to this collection. My name is Jennifer Peace, and I had the pleasure of working with several of our panelists today. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I know them to all be wonderful educators. And so let me just dive in and introduce our panelists. The topic of our panel is interreligious education in a time of pandemic. And you know, all of our panelists have an enduring commitment to education and leadership formation that predates the current moment, but certainly I think all of us who are educators have been challenged and called to reckon with and respond to the current conditions marked by at least 3 pandemics. If we think about racism, if we think about economic turmoil, and certainly if we think about COVID-19 and all the kinds of changes that has affected in our day-to-day lives, including the first ever virtual American Academy of Religions. I was really curious to see how this would feel, but it feels normal because my whole life has looked like this in the last several months. So our panelists today include wonderful interreligious and educators of all stripes. Lucinda Mosher is the senior editor for the Journal of Interreligious Studies. She is a faculty associate in interfaith studies at Hartford Seminary and the rapporteur of the Building Bridges Seminar, an annual dialogue of Christian and Muslim scholars now under the stewardship of Georgetown University. Dr. Mosher is the author of 7 books and editor of 11. She's a fabulous collaborator, as any of us who have worked with her know. In addition, she's the guest editor of thematic issues for several journals. Irvin Scott is a senior lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He previously served as deputy director for K-12 education at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In an effort to address educational inequities in the US, Dr. Scott also led an effort at the foundation to build strong partnerships and deeper engagement between faith-based organizations that serve underrepresented students, families, and communities. Rabbi Or Rose is the founding director of the Betty Ann Greenbaum Miller Center for Interreligious Leadership and Learning of Hebrew College. He is a co-publisher of the Journal of Interreligious Studies. He is co-editor of Words to Live By, Sacred Sources for Interreligious Engagement, and Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Essential Teachings. Rabbi Rose is also the creator of the weekly scriptural commentary series, 70 Faces of Torah, and curator of the web-based project Psalm Season. And he was my co-conspirator for many years when we co-directed a center between Hebrew College and Andover Newton. And I learned a lot of what I know about interreligious education with and from Or. Celine Ibrahim is our fourth panelist. She is a faculty member at the Department of Religious Studies and Philosophy at Groton School. She has published widely, and her work aims to enhance cultural and religious literacy. She's very much a public voice on issues of religion and civic engagement. And she's deeply committed to counteracting bigotry and fostering values of pluralism, integrity, and civic responsibility. She is the author of Women and Gender in the Quran and the editor of One Nation Indivisible, Seeking Liberty and Justice from the Pulpit to the Streets. It's an anthology exploring interreligious engagement as a way to overcome anti-Muslim prejudice. And all of these folks that I've had the privilege to work with, I know to be such thoughtful educators. And I think, will really have a lot to share with us today about ways in which this moment has called on them to maybe think more deeply about and engage in various ways in the work that they've committed themselves to. So I want to dive right into the conversation. Our first question for each of the panelists, and I'm going to suggest we go in that order I just introduced you. So Lucinda, Irving, Rabbi Or, and Celine Ibrahim. But the first question is just to ask each of you, what have the triple pandemics I just named, economic, in terms of racism and in terms of COVID, taught you about your work as an interreligious educator? Lucinda, would you launch us into that conversation?
I will try. What has it taught me? I think that one thing that these triple pressures have taught me is that I have what I need. I just need to put it to good use. And so I haven't felt unprepared to keep doing what needs to be done. That's been good. It's been an interesting experience just to deal with these three strikingly difficult pressures at the same time. I think if there's one thing that has stood out for me, it's that in my syllabus planning, I could stand to be even more explicitly intersectional than I have been in the past. That's something I'm definitely working on. And you would think that would be a no-brainer. I am the matriarch of an intensely, how can I say it? An intensely diverse family, ethnically, racially, any other thing you want to lift up. The Mosier clan writ large, we're that. And so you would think that all of the intersectional issues would come naturally to me, but perhaps because they are part of what seems normal for me, I forget that I need to be explicit. And so that is a lesson that really has struck me over the last few months. And as I think about what I want to do next semester, particularly where I'm like,
Hey, Eric. We didn't decide, and I've got to get Gracie something.
Oops.
somebody's put themselves on mute. Sorry about that. As I think about teaching faith in the neighborhood type course again, where we're exploring America's religious diversity, how can I do that in a more intersectional way than I have in the past?
Thank you. Dr. Scott, would you like to weigh in?
Sure, sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me, Jennifer. Just a shout out real quick to our mutual colleague, Or. He's one of the reasons why I'm here. And he's a great colleague and friend, and super excited to be a part of this conversation. Appreciate the other panels. Building on Lucinda, what has it taught me? It's probably taught me a couple of things. One is that we need all hands on deck. What I've been saying is we need all hands, all hearts, and all heads on deck to respond to the second thing that I've learned as a result of these pandemics, and I think it's something we all realize, is that the most vulnerable communities, the most marginalized communities get hit by these things in more intense ways. And so as a result of that, we need everybody to join in the work, the conversation and the work of improving outcomes. In my case, I'm most interested in outcomes for children. I'm an educator. I've been a teacher, a principal, a district leader at the Gates Foundation. I did work that was focused on improving educational outcomes for children. We all know that you can't improve educational outcomes without thinking about other outcomes like social and emotional outcomes and how kids are affected by trauma, which the most vulnerable children are. So all three of those things add trauma to communities, add trauma to the most vulnerable communities. And if we're going to respond to their needs, we need all hands, all heads, all hearts on deck, which is the third learning. And that leads to the third learning. You can't bring all hands, all heads, all hearts on deck without being really intentional about how you bring people from different perspectives, be they faith perspectives, race perspective, economic perspective, together in safe ways for them to do work together, right? So those three learnings are probably the key three learnings for me.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Rose.
Thank you, Dr. Peace. Again, I want to thank all of you for joining us for this panel and for the program as a whole. And following on the wisdom of the two previous speakers, I will say that one of the lessons that I have learned and continue to learn is that I feel that simultaneously, I am called in a way that feels less ambiguous than ever before. I have stopped thinking quite as much about, am I smart enough? Am I learned enough? Am I fill in the blanks? And at the same time, a greater sense of humility about what it is that I can contribute and the need to turn to other people for help and for guidance. And that combination has been very powerful, not new, but renewed. And I would say the same is true about my rabbinate. Never before have I felt more comfortable being a rabbi simply because there are so many needs. And I'm privileged to be in a position to be of some help to people. But it is of some help and not to everyone on every front. And so that's been very important to me. The second piece that I'll make mention of is the need personally, and then also appropriately in professional contexts, to share my own sense of pain, loss, and dislocation, and not to do it so that I am in a woe is me or solipsistic fashion, but to be honest with myself psycho-spiritually about just how difficult this time has been in so many different ways for me, for my family, for my friends, and then orbiting outwards to so many other people. And Mary Elizabeth Moore, who has been a partner in this work and a wise sage, was very helpful in helping me articulate this in terms of coming in touch with our own pain, loss, yearning as a way of bridging and of exploring and enlarging our capacity for empathy. And so not putting away in some kind of unhealthy and unhelpful fashion in a bottom drawer all that is difficult, but trying to allow that to help me form a bridge and to think more expansively, more deeply, more humanely about how other people are in pain and suffering. And the last thing that I'll say is, again, speaking quite personally, as a person that had COVID, whose entire family had COVID, the contingency of health and well-being and the capacity that it takes for people to do good work for others is sometimes so precarious. And so I feel like I am blessed to be able to be healthy enough to be contributing.
Thank you very much, Or.
Yeah, thank you, Or.
Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you. I resonate with so much of what has been said. And for me, I've been thinking a lot about this kind of state of emergency versus a state of normalcy. And in so many ways, both kind of personally and collectively as a society, we've been asked to carry on with a state of normalcy as much as possible in this state of urgency. And partly the attention to racial justice issues over the summer, and it has created a sort of state of emergency around those issues, as if there wasn't already a state of emergency, before. And so I've been thinking a lot around how to not play into this sensational, kind of this waking up of America, but also take advantage of this kind of waking up moment to kind of push an agenda that maybe I've always kind of had, but just have an ability to do it a bit more boldly now that there's more widespread support. And in thinking about my own kind of roles in justice issues and my own kind of positionality, it's pushed me to be a bolder educator. But then in being a bolder educator, I've also kind of found myself in good trouble, if you will say, if we can say that, and which has in turn pushed me to think about the ways in which I was able to live most of my life without getting into good trouble because of privileges and because of identities and platforms. And so it's really, these times are really asking kind of me personally, and I think many of us, to ask ourselves, kind of, what are we willing to sacrifice for a vision, or for somebody else's well-being, or for to really educate from kind of a depth of being, rather than a simple memorize this, memorize that, that's great writing, good, you pass the course. And so I'm really thinking a lot about what it means to be an educator who is bold and willing to take risks, but also who's very humble and who's always kind of learning her own expanding boundaries and expanding horizons and limits. And I've been thinking a lot about, to what extent can I push institutions or push people within institutions to make changes, and to what extent do I just have to be patient? And a lot of that is discernment, but I think it's personal discernment for me, but I think there's also a collective dimension to this. How much change can we sustain? How quickly? And how can we keep it going when there's a spotlight, when there's an opening?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to each of you. I want to move from the broader perspective of some of these lessons learned that you're sharing to more specifics about what each of you has been doing in your own contexts. So the second question for the panel is to ask that you describe one recent project that has been shaped specifically by the various upheavals we've been describing, and what you've learned from that project. And maybe I'll open this more broadly to the four of you to share in whatever order makes sense for you this time. So whoever feels compelled to dive in first, please.
I'm happy to go first because I'm going to talk about my chapter in the book. And again, commercial, you know, we're very, very excited about the book. I think a little bit of context is helpful. I do teach at Hartford Seminary. I have been there for many years, but I actually reside in Northeast Florida. And in previous terms, I might pop up to Connecticut every now and then. There were several years where I spent part of every month in Connecticut and the rest of the time either in New York or Florida. That all has ended. That ended in March. No more trips to Hartford for the foreseeable future. Since 2016, I've been doing all of my teaching online and asynchronous online models of course design. And so I was well ahead of the curve on how to teach online when all of us had to make that move. And I'm part-time at Hartford Seminary, so normally I have, for many years, have not been teaching in the summer term, but this past year, I got a call saying, gee, we could really use more online summer courses. Could you put together one? So I turned in a syllabus that was a comparative theology course that I thought would be really fun. And a couple of days later, I got a phone call saying, we really need something else, and we need something that addresses this moment. It would be, we just must, and you are equipped to do that. And I said, yes, I will put something together. And what I was asked to put together really drew on absolutely every aspect of my preparation for teaching. It drew on the fact that I'm a theologian in the Episcopal tradition, the Anglican tradition. It drew upon the fact that I've done a lot of chaplaincy education. It drew upon the fact that I have taught about America's religious diversity for a long, long time, and have also facilitated disaster preparedness trainings numerous times, brought to the campus by another agency. So just many, many elements had to come together in a 6-week course online, which was meant to go at double speed. It was meant to be a full semester course accomplished in 6 weeks. And the other thing was, I got a call from an email from the business office saying, you know, we have to have at least 8 people in the course for it to float. So just keep that in mind. And I said, well, I'm doing my best to spread the word. 50 people later, we had, that's very large for a Hartford Seminary enrollment, to have 50 people in one course from 4 continents. And so thank God it was asynchronous, because we didn't have to worry about what time it was for anybody. They just did the work as they wished. And the other thing I had to be sure of as I thought about what sort of an experience this would be, was that it couldn't be just about COVID-19, but that it did have to be about resilience, about lament, about creative use of solitude, about all of the things that we were faced with in that moment. So when the incident in Minnesota made it so that we now knew for sure that we were in a double, if not triple pandemic, the pivot was effortless, because we really were already thinking in these kinds of intersectional terms. The thing that I think I learned about the whole experience of putting this course together and facilitating it is that it is totally possible to have a very intimate retreat-like experience for an online course, even though you've got 50 participants on 4 continents. That there was a bonding that took place almost immediately. There was a deep caring. I learned that it's very important for me to be on camera every now and then, talking to my students as I'm talking to you now, just sharing what I saw in their posts, that sort of thing. It was a growing experience for me too. It was very, very deep. And I hope that I get another opportunity like this again, but under different circumstances, perhaps. We don't need a triple pandemic to have those kinds of opportunities.
Thank you, Lucinda. Yeah, responses from the other panelists.
I can follow up on that also from the classroom context. And so I'm working with high schoolers, and a survey course that I'm teaching, it's global world religious history. But it was, when I inherited the course, it was more focused on these are the 5 big traditions. And I've completely upended the way that I'm teaching it. So now, we're starting with Indigenous traditions and spending a considerable amount of time. And one of the challenges in that for me is that in my own education, I have not spent a considerable amount of time on Indigenous traditions. And so, I'm calling people and trying to have conversations and cure resources because the teaching so radically needs to change, not, as I said before, not just to meet the moment, but it's probably needed to change for a long time. And so, and that work it's asking me to step into the space in a way where I'm already decentralizing kind of authority in the classroom, because I come from feminist hermeneutics, and that's the way that I find I learn best. But it's really, I have to really embrace my own sense of learning with these students. And that can be, depending on who your students are, at what place in their journey. When you're working with high schoolers, you also have to establish a certain amount of I am the authority. And so I'm trying to figure out, how to do this well, how to hold this kind of radical humility, and also how in this space to bring my commitments in saying, Indigenous justice issues matter, and we should pay attention to them, and and making it kind of maybe a values claim in a space that maybe more traditionally was not about so much making values claims. It was just about, learning information. And so I'm trying to figure out how to hold this place of bringing my own passions and convictions, into teaching in a way that doesn't feel like I am exerting too much kind of like authority over these young people who are still very much in formation. I don't want them to think like me, but I do want them to think about some of the issues that I care about. So I'm learning very much how to hold that tension.
Great. So I'll just follow up there. So in order to understand perhaps the 2 projects that I'll share, I'll give you a little more context. So I grew up in the church, in the African-American church. The denomination is Church of God in Christ. So some of you may be familiar with Kojic, Protestant denomination. My father's a bishop in that church. And so that's always been a rich part of my own identity over the years of being an educator. It's always been a part of who I am. As a matter of fact, when I was in the church as a young fella, following my father everywhere because he was a preacher and I liked to carry his Bible in his briefcase, it made me feel important, and he made me his little assistant and all of that. People used to come up to me all the time and say, "You're going to be a preacher just like your dad. You're going to be a pastor. You're going to be a bishop. I see it in you." And I'm not sure what they saw in me because I never became a pastor, but I did become an educator. And as I say to people, I didn't lead in a church, but I have led in a classroom, in a school, in a district, and so forth and so on. But one of the premises of a lot of the work that I do at Harvard now is that faith identities are important parts of the identity of many educators, but they never talk about it because of the separation of church and state. They feel like it's not a safe place to bring up that part of their identity, like race might be, or like other parts of their identity. Religious identity or faith tradition, can't talk about that. I kind of think that's a problem, because I think in order for you to fully do job that you're really passionate about, you should bring all of you. But the question becomes, how do you bring all of you into public spaces without proselytizing? And so a lot of the work that I do at Harvard lately, although I continue to do sort of the traditional work of preparing school leaders, principals, and nonprofit leaders, but I do have this course where it's called Faith, Education, and Leadership. And it's all about how you bring your faith to your work in the public space, and how you do it safely, and how you create space for other people to do it safely, so that you feel like you're fully there, and you do it in a way that is not threatening to educators, not threatening to kids. So that's the course that I teach. I started teaching that course the spring of this year, and then COVID happened, and everything else began to happen as our panelists have articulated, these 3 pandemics. And then we just pivoted in that course. That course was always going to be about bringing your faith identity, so forth and so on. But then it became also about how do you create spaces where other faith organizations can be involved in responding to these 3 pandemics, right? So it's not just about your identity, but how do you create spaces for others to bring their identity, and for faith institutions to also get involved? Because as I said earlier, we need all hands, all hearts, and all heads on deck, but we can't just get on deck without figuring out how we actually get on deck without killing each other. So we got to figure that out. And so that's what the course is about. The thing that I'm going to drop in the chat is that we've taken that course and the work that we do at the Leadership Institute for Faith and Education to another level, in that we are offering a course, online course, next year around faith and education partnerships, particularly faith and public education partnerships. So how can faith organizations be more involved? How can they be more knowledgeable around things like inequities in schools? How can they be more knowledgeable about the policies that perpetuate these inequities? And then how do they do something about it going forward? And so that's the second project that we're involved in, and we're currently building that course, and would love for others to be involved at some point in time.
So I too will make mention of 2 projects. One of them is the subject of my chapter in the book, and that is the Psalm Season project, which several people who are present have contributed to in one way or another. And it grew out of the experience of co-teaching a course at Hebrew College with a colleague at Boston College. And what happened when we had to go online was quite interesting, in that the conversations around the Book of Psalms, and the course was designed intentionally as an interdisciplinary exploration, not only of the ancient texts, but their reception and their uses in various liturgical and other settings, was that the meetings themselves became a kind of ritual gathering, because people were lonely, because people were feeling isolated, because people were feeling frightened. So both the message and the method, if you will, the text and the context came together in quite a stirring way. And people's willingness to share more openly, more vulnerably, also increased. And from that experience, I was inspired to reach out far and wide to friends and colleagues to contribute to this online version of the project called Psalm Season, which is an act of public theology, if you will. And in that project, I was blessed to be working very closely with my dear friend, Reverend Paul Rauschenbusch from the Interfaith Youth Corps, and many other people. And one other thing to say relating to that project is that we intentionally created an 18-week cycle, because the number 18 in Hebrew is the numerical equivalent to life. And so we wanted to try and provide people with grounding, with texts that had history, which were used in times of trouble by many people, which hadn't been explored mostly by people from Jewish, Christian, other traditions together even as they explore them separately in times of trouble. And so that was a wrinkle, an innovation. But as Irvin said, what I appreciated anew were all of the relationships that I and Paul and others had developed, the network of interreligious, cross-cultural educators, writers, musicians, poets, etc. And that requires ongoing effort. And we know there's important social scientific research about having those webs of connection before crises. So there's no way that we could have launched and offered this project on such short notice had we not known all of these wonderful people and been able to call or Zoom and say, one song, 500 words, say something that will help people. And we've reached thousands of people. And there's much more work to be done with the project. And so now we're thinking about a curriculum and a book version, but it really emerged out of this moment of pandemic. And then of course, as the other crises, long-standing diseases in this country came to the fore, people commented, people reflected, people lamented. That was a major part, I think, of the project and why it was appealing to so many people, was a context in which the texts and the history and the people that were participating affirmed that lament is a holy act. The other projects that I've been involved with more recently are youth-centered. And I traditionally, and we at the Miller Center, have not to date spent most of our energy on teens, but have worked with other populations. And in that context, it has been eye-opening to see the resilience of young people in the midst of situations that are so perilous, and the need to also to accompany them. As Celine was saying, not to dictate, but to accompany, to hold, to witness, to encourage, etc. And I've been buoyed by the staff that are facilitating these programs, and also inspired anew by younger people. And it's a reminder of just how precious that population is. And I would say in this context that we haven't yet invested enough in interreligious or interfaith education for children and teens. I think there are other contexts in which we've done more advanced work. And so this is an emerging focus for us at the Miller Center and some of the folks on this panel.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate how the panelists all represent kind of education across the age spectrum in many ways. And I think that is really an interesting note to think about as this field continues to develop. We have one more question. I just want to say, I also noticed how many times our panelists use words like, what surprised me when we had to go online was, or then we pivoted, or I had one day to provide the syllabus. And there's this sense of the gifts and skills that we have are enough and are needed, and that there's no time for, in a year, I'll send you a copy of. And I take that as a personal challenge to myself. I like to have all my ducks in a row before I send them out swimming. And I love how our panelists bravely are diving in ways that are so needed right now. So I just wanted to underscore that and give all of us a little courage boost for what we have and what's needed in the world. Okay, so our last question is really to ask how these triple pandemics have challenged interreligious or otherwise. And I might ask, just for the sake of time, we just have we have about 7 minutes. If we go in that perceived order again, with starting with Lucinda.
Thank you. And thank you all for being with us. I forgot to say that when I started way back many minutes ago, and it really is a joy for us at the Journal to have you all with us today. I've been thinking a lot about this question about how the triple pandemics have challenged and shaped our understanding of solidarity. And I've been wondering, has it, I am not sure that I feel that exactly. I feel perhaps my isolation in Northeast Florida more acutely. I live in a kind of a, I don't know how to, not exactly a bedroom community of Jacksonville, but certainly not a metropolis either. I'm sort of here. I do work that is for a number of agencies, none of which are in Florida. So my work is, I live here, but my work is elsewhere. And so I guess if anything, what the triple pandemic has done by shoving everything online has been to make it so that I am less isolated in the work I do than I was 9 months ago. I am now expected at numerous faculty meetings where before committee meetings would happen and I would never know. Now I feel much more involved in my school, and I'm glad of that. I delight in the collegiality that I'm able to share with my colleagues, as far as, and our seminary is intensely interfaith in its own way. So that's been a really good thing. In terms of interreligious relations writ larger, it's made me realize that if I'm going to continue to be involved at all, it's going to be in this virtual world. I'm of an age and health that going out and doing the kind of field research that I once did is not going to happen anymore. But that does not mean that I'm disengaged. And so if anything, it's made other people have to do it the way I've had to do it for a number of years. And we've met in this new center of really rich interreligious work. I'm editing a massive book right now, and to have the kind of authorial team on my side could only have happened because I could reach out so easily through the internet, that I can so easily ask for last minute edits and get them. You know, so there's a different kind of relationship that's possible now that I find quite positive. I'm sure there's a flip side to it. I'll leave that to other people to describe.
Thank you, Lucinda. I definitely resonate with what you're sharing there. I think I'll frame it in 3 ways. One is sort of personal teaching. I feel like this is really pushing my teaching, and I think Lucinda alluded to this a little bit. And that I'm a very sort of emotive, need to be in a space. Think of a Pentecostal preacher, and you are probably thinking of me as a teacher, right? And so I don't have that necessarily. I'm not in proximity to my classroom, and so my classes. And so I've had to find ways to bring that part of who I am and the way I instruct and the way I engage. And I've had to use technology in order to do that. Or I've had to use things that weren't at my disposal when I'm face to face, like asynchronous teaching, right? Like standing up and teaching on my own and doing it in a real passionate way, and then giving it to the students to experience for themselves. So there are ways that I've had to be creative with my teaching, but sure enough, as I say to my students, technology can't stop humanity from coming through. So if you're real, if you're human, it comes through Zoom and any other form. And so does inauthenticity, right? If you're not real, if you're not connecting, that comes through. So that's one thing. The second thing is, and I think this again builds on Lucinda, I do feel like the world that we're moving into, you're just going to have to figure out how to use technology to expand the number of people that you're engaging with. I think it's an amazing opportunity going forward, but it does require us to think differently about how we use technology. And if you don't do it you won't survive in this next level of work. The third thing is a risk, because one of the things that I was a teacher for many years. I was a high school principal for many years. And I continue to wonder who we're missing in this Zoom world. Who aren't we being proximate to as we do this work? Who's not on Zoom and who's not feeling as comfortable? Right now, I have a wife who's teaching upstairs, and she's teaching high school students pre-calculus in Boston. And she's doing that online. But I think to myself, wait, there's an opportunity for me to potentially be closer to that world virtually, since I'm trying to prepare leaders for it. How can I take advantage of that so that I don't risk becoming more disconnected from those who we're ultimately trying to have impact on? So I don't want to lose the risk that the state is providing.
Thanks to both of you. I'm jotting notes as I also try and formulate my own thoughts. I want to double down on something I said before, which is about arts and culture, about music and poetry and visual art. Again, I feel like those have been such important parts of my own spiritual and psychological journey and have played a much larger role in my teaching. And I underestimated in the past the ways in which people can connect in and through those modalities. And I've just seen it in spades through the Psalm Season project and other related endeavors. The other thing that I'll say is, like everyone else, increasing and deepening sensitivity to inequities. And I'll give just one example that shook me, and it's good that it shook me. In planning a new youth commission, the Boston Youth Commission on COVID-19 with several grassroots organizations, we were discussing honoraria or fellowships and the like. And at some point, one of my partners in this endeavor, an African-American Muslim man who runs an inner city organization, said, if we are going to do this and we truly want to reach kids that are leaders or potential leaders in the hardest hit communities in Greater Boston, honoraria and fellowships that are symbolic are inadequate. We need to actually pay them a living wage. And he was quite insistent that it had to be above the minimum wage. And I agreed, but I hadn't thought about it. And I would not have thought about it in the same way, with the same urgency, Jenny, as you said before, had we not together rolled up our sleeves and said, there are so many things we can't do, but let's do this. And then to listen carefully to other people with other life experience and expertise that I simply don't have. Even when I think of myself as being a progressive, thoughtful, evolved, inclusive person. And that was a very important reminder about the realities of wringing our hands and asking who is not at the table and why have we not invited them, or why have they not come when we've made overtures, and then thinking about the nitty-gritty and the very basic issue of money and time. And that has been a tremendous learning about expanding who is at the table and about allyship and thinking about those together in a braided and more holistic way.
Yeah, or your last comments there resonate exactly with what I was going to say, and that's the economic disparities. And to what extent do we felt the effects of this pandemic? That might depend on our racial identity, that might depend on our socioeconomic identity. And in this mode, we're kind of in like this survival mode, and to what extent are we really taking in, and I say we, those who have this immense socioeconomic privilege, to what extent are we really taking in the fact that we have like bread lines, food lines in this country that, I mean, just breaks your heart. But then again, so I'm constantly between this challenge, and maybe others on this call feel the same way, between, the conceptual work that needs to be done, and there's a lot of that, and then there's just basic stuff that needs to be done. So that's kind of where I am, and where is solidarity in this? I think it's, to what extent, how can we get out and be helping, and on basic issues, not just the conceptual ones. So that's kind of where I'm pushing myself to be more proactive.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all 4 of our panelists. I really appreciated that we started with pandemic and challenge, and we heard from our panelists about humility, authenticity, risk, opportunity, the arts, solidarity, flexibility. It's a wonderful mix of reflections for people to take into the small group conversations. I might just pose as the general question, what are the emergent opportunities that you see as educators, given the circumstances that we've been discussing? And Tom is posting, I think, the specific questions I asked our panelists. And on that note, a little round of applause for all our panelists. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your insights.
Jenny, thank you too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Seriously, thank you. Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thank you, Jenny.
All right, we have about 10 minutes. I tried assigning rooms, and I think I have everyone with the option to be able to move rooms, but if not, just come back into the room and I can reassign the main room, and I can reassign you. All right, so thank you, everybody. We'll come back at 3:30. Carol, you're muted.
Oh, hi there. Again, I have to teach now. So
okay, not a problem. Thank you for joining us.
View of education. I've really been very aware of that old saying of, who is wise? The person who learns from everyone. And the correlate for me is that you can learn from all kinds of situations, and to be sensitive and responsive to that. And the variety of educational priorities and situations in this group is wonderful. But I just wanted to expand it that one next step for those of us who are not currently, in a classroom, even a virtual classroom setting, that happens in all kinds of ways. And certainly, where I am with my work, and it's wonderful to learn from each other. So thank you.
Thanks, Millie. Other thoughts? That one, and I'm hoping this can be more of a conversation than a classroom calling on people situation. So feel free to just jump in.
I would be very curious to hear from others about their own experiments. What has worked? What have they been surprised by? What are they struggling with? Patrice, I see you. I don't know if you're in Canada or Europe at the moment, but I'm also curious to hear about are the things that you're experimenting with there, the things that you see your colleagues working on similar or different? Are there particular emphases that we're not capturing or that are more or less urgent? So any of those would be wonderful and enriching.
Thanks, Or, for the invitation to add a perspective. I'm based actually in Montreal in Canada, so it's not that far away from the vast majority, I think, of who's online at the moment. But I do, I do part-time consulting and I used to go every month to Vienna until March, and I keep, of course, very close contact every week with my colleagues over there. So from that perspective, I think a lot of the work we've been doing is very similar to what I've heard so far in our exchange. We are dealing a lot with international global dynamics and all affected by COVID, sorry. And so that to me is the main sort of thing that comes out so far is the similarities that I hear from the American perspective, when talk about the triple sort of crisis and pandemic. And the ways in which it affects other parts of the world in a similar and at times even more complex ways, especially in areas of serious conflict, of violent war or civil war context in particular. And so that I think is something maybe that I haven't heard so far, but that I want to add to the complexity of the picture on an international level, depending on, of course, very specific regional context. Another element I would say is the ways in which there has been a wonderful sort of global G20 interfaith forum that took place about a month ago, out of which there's a very strong call to action. A whole first section of it is dealing with interreligious collaboration at a time of COVID. So for those of you who are interested in going sort of and seeing maybe an international perspective that comes out, not just from a meeting, because normally this meeting would have taken place in a traditional in-person way, in a conference kind of setting, maybe up to 200 people or so. But now we were able to do 6 different regional consultations with anywhere from 20, 30 people to over 100 people for each of the regional consultation, in addition to half a dozen thematic consultation on the environment, on sanitary sort of crises and emergencies, and so on and so forth, and education, for example, that dovetails with what we talked about here. And so the call to action, which is, I don't know, it's like 140 some pages, really has a huge amount of material. I'll just put the link in the chat room in a few minutes. So that I think might help understand that what has emerged so far from mostly an American context with all of its diversity is in fact pretty similar to what's happening, at least in my indirect and partly direct experience internationally. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, as I was sharing with my group, I'm based in Rome. So yeah, the other on the other side of the ocean. And something that is really striking me, I work with the John Paul II Center for Interreligious Dialogue, and I think that I realize even more how it's important for students to get to physically be with people of other religious communities in order to start learning more about them, about their faith, about the way they live their life, and it's getting evident. On the other hand, what I think it's good, it's sane, and we hope that at some point we will be able to be back to this kind of physical interactions, because they tell us a lot about how we live and how we live our faith. But on the other hand, there is something that it's really interesting in this period, and it's the really wider possibilities that students have right now of interacting at a very international level. And that's actually opening so many more opportunities for them. I was running this afternoon a scriptural reasoning online session with people from 7 different countries, and that's a chance. It's not that it was not possible before, because it was possible, but that's now we take the time, because in any case it will be virtual even if it's with people around the corner, but we also take the time of really learning what Patrice was telling us about, really this wider international perspective. So yeah, I would say that this is something we're receiving a lot from, also with our students. Thank you.
I'd like to build on what Elena said. So nice to see you again, Elena, after long years. At the Dialogue Institute at Temple, we now have about 250 graduates of our summer program on religious pluralism. The State Department gave us money, even during the time of COVID, to do virtual programming. We've been doing that monthly, and the young people have been reporting their response to COVID, and it's quite humbling. These young people, who would be now in their 25 to 35 age range group, at least 50 of them are very involved in an international network of some kind, responding to the immediate needs of the marginalized. And they don't have any trouble keeping their own boundaries and crossing over in order to network. It's quite encouraging.
Or you're muted.
Sorry, I wanted to pick up on something that Monica put in the chat and ask Shelton if you would also comment on the question of embodiment, hospitality, physical connection, because you've been doing some interesting things with our youth to try and connect them and make them feel more held and supported. So maybe you could say a few words about that, because I think it links to what Monica also talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm reading your chat right now, Monica. So I am one of a program facilitator of the Dignity Project with work with teens, and yeah, I think it's a word we use a lot is embodied, or we tell people we want to get back into our bodies as much as possible, and not just be floating heads and not just be talking voices, but to really understand ourselves. And so, from everything to, like, we always start with a grounding physical step up, get on your feet, roam around your house, find something, come share it with the group, something just as simple as that, to providing a Grubhub meal. As a way of, we have extra budget, and all of us, I think most of us are probably sitting a little bit with some extra budget to go, hey, we had this program, what do we do with this? And we have to think creatively how to use it. So we've been doing that. We've been doing really fun care packages. It's actually been really exciting to see mentors that come from various different backgrounds, countries, religious contexts, and they're all writing their own story in a letter to them. And so even just to receive a letter, and the youth have said, like, receiving care packages has been like the thing that they look forward to on a monthly basis, and the ability to order food and to share a meal together, and to show things from your house. And so we've been getting creative about how we can get back into our bodies and really meet with one another in a way that feels different than, at least for the majority of them, they're spending hours on Zoom. So we're also trying to distinguish what we're doing from what they're doing in their classroom on Zoom every day. So, or did that cover it? Did I miss something? yeah, so those are some examples of different different things that we're doing.
We have time for maybe one last input before we move to Mary Elizabeth for some closing reflections. Any takers?
I'm going to call somebody else out. Bob. Paula was in some ways an outlier on our first panel in that she self-identified as not being a part of this interreligious interfaith studies world. And you are a part of her professional world. So I'm curious what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what has moved you, what we can learn from the work that you're doing and others like Paula dialogically, that we might not be focusing on enough or not seeing or hearing.
Oh, that's a pretty tall order, or maybe I can give a little snippet. I think I really resonated with what Paula said about keeping our roles very distinct. You know, as a dialogue facilitator, my role is a particular role, and I often make the analogy to being a clergy person, that you're the clergy person for the whole church or synagogue, not just for the people that you think are correct. So the role distinction, I think, is really important. And another thing that Paula mentioned that we were talking about in our small group was creating a context where people can bring all of their identities to the table. Because when people start feeling permission of the group to bring multiple identities, you know, as your gender identity, your parent, or whatever, it's much easier for people to talk about their religious identity. If they know that there's a complexity that's welcomed here and not just a mono focus on one or two aspects of identity. So those are the things I think that in terms of our profession of creating context for conversation, that are really useful. And as I've been bringing this into, you know, higher ed for numbers of years, I find that's one of the things that people really respond to. One other small thing is, I used to be with Public Conversations Project and now still with Essential Partners as an associate, which was rooted in family therapy ideas. And from that discipline, we have taken the slogan, if you will, join and move. So people are really not willing to shift until they feel seen, until they feel connected to. So when we create these contexts for conversations, creating opportunities for people to be seen, so that they'll be willing to open their eyes and see each other.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you everyone for sharing. We know this is intensely brief, but please, I've been trying to capture some of the thoughts in the chat and some of what people are sharing into the Google document. Please go take a look there and jot down any wisdom that is missing or that you want to see in there. And with that, I will turn the Zoom yellow box over to Mary Elizabeth Moore, who is the outgoing dean from BU School of Theology and publisher emerita with the Journal of Interreligious Studies, and a longtime colleague on the journal and in the field. So Mary Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. And I realize there's not a lot of time, so I wonder if you could make me co-host so I can post something.
Yes, you are co-host. You can go right ahead.
Perfect, thank you. I'm posting this because there are a lot of words on this page. As we've gone through the day, I have been so moved by the power of words and images and projects and insights. And I have taken notes, and I have tried to identify vital interreligious, interfaith practices that you have named throughout the day. And so in these closing remarks, I want to give you back to yourselves. And I've identified 4 major themes, and you'll see them 1, 2, 3, 4. And I've identified practices within each theme. Each theme is a mega practice, and I've identified practices within each theme. And I'm posting this so you can read along with me, and I won't have to read every word, which you'll be grateful that I won't do. But you'll notice that in this text that you're seeing in front of you, I've put names beside some of these themes so that you can go back and think more about what Irvin said or Allison. So here we go. The first mega practice is being in the presence of one another. And several of you have spoken to this. You've spoken about sharing human and religious experiences. Irvin said something about this. The chat had comments on this. Secondly, you have commented on the importance of reflecting on ourselves. What can I contribute to the community? What is my pain and the pain of my communities, and how can that pain help me create bridges of empathy? Another highlight here was confessing personal and community failure as a way to make space for significant change to emerge. And someone added to the chat Keisha Rom's idea of cultural humility. The second mega practice is conversing and communing. And you notice I haven't used the word dialogue because the word conversing comes from crossing with. And so I've tried to emphasize that crossing with dimension of our ways of being together. And you've named several. Converse across the world together, sort of a big way of stating this, whether it's in mother-daughter conversations, as Funayo said, and I'm so sorry, Funayo, I think I'm mispronouncing your name badly. Can someone help me with the pronunciation?
Fundalayo.
Funyalo?
Fundalayo.
Fundalayo.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Fundalayo.
Great.
Thank you. And those conversations, as you described them, were both in private, you and your mother, and in public settings. And you, Paula talked about setting the table. She didn't use that language, I'm using it, but setting a table. Bob Staines just referred to it as well, and preparing people for dialogues across difference, inviting people to come together. You also talked about creating spaces for both confrontation and care, so both can happen in the community. Several of you accented humility, including devotional humility, which Rebecca Mays added to the chat, and what Rabbi Michael Cohen described, emphasized as to remember that we do not, that we need not think that our views are the only ones. I give attention to both intra and interreligious dialogue. Seek areas of shared concern to push beyond binaries and either/or arguments about religious freedom and other interreligious matters, and to create possibilities for people to share the sacred with one another. Fundalayo gave some really wonderful examples of that. Separate people from their ideas or religious, political, and other passions, recognizing that people are full-bodied human beings, and that you might honor them as people and not just identify them with their particular passions or ideas. The third mega practice is transforming our teaching, research, and action. And you name several ways to do that. One of which is to respond in our projects to deep hurts, limitations, and yearnings. And I think Or's example of Psalm season was striking in this regard. Another was to do research and teaching that is ever more intersectional, Lucinda. Draw upon technology in new and more full-bodied ways, Lucinda and Irvin. And then Luis talked about doing good history, seeking to discover history from diverse sources and interpreters so as to crack open assumptions that people lay upon text and that distort the histories that we think we know and limit the potential of history to teach us. To reshape approaches and content of teaching, creating radically new approaches and focusing on traditions that have been underrepresented in your own earlier teaching. Lucinda, Celine, and Irvin spoke to that. And seek ways by which people can bring all of themselves in public spaces and to education. Irvin. Seek the deep questions beneath controversial questions regarding sexual orientation, gender identity, or any other concern that strikes strong and oppositional passions. What are the questions underneath those questions that we think are so divisive? And stretch our perspectives by engaging with international movements and projects, which was just raised in the discussion, with some specific examples. The fourth mega practice is to work together towards social transformation. And many of you spoke to this in all kinds of ways, but Irvin named it as join all hands hearts. All hands, heads, hearts to address critical issues of justice and, in his case, specifically issues of education. Work together on community projects that came forward in chat, and several of you also identified that. And then finally, build upon the urgency of the moment, this moment, to act and become emboldened in risk-taking, whether it's in teaching institutions in our own lives or in the communities in which we live and serve. You folks are brilliant. Thank you, thank you.
Miss Mary, this is Naima speaking. I gave you the incorrect pronunciation. Her name is Funlayo. Nope, don't put the D in it. I did that, thinking of someone else. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nima Funlayo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Elizabeth, for that fantastic summary and digestion of the wisdom. And if it's okay with you, I can add that to the Google document that we have that people have access to reflect on that further in the future. And on behalf of the journal team and AIS, thank you all for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor to have this group together and to celebrate also this milestone for the journal. I wanted to do a few reminders in the last couple of minutes that we have scheduled. One is a reiteration. I mentioned this in the chat, but the 10th anniversary volume will be available through Amazon for purchase. I'm waiting to get the confirmation back from Amazon. They have a little slower turnaround on reviewing the book, but as soon as we have that link available, we will share it with everyone who registered for this event via email. And a reminder about our new podcast that Axel mentioned. We will also be sharing information about it via email, but you can check it out on our website. I just added the link to the chat. Our latest issue of the journal is also available on the website. If you haven't had a chance to look at that, it's always free and always available online. And a reminder that we also do a special issue of the journal focused on AAR and SBL. So if you have any pieces or hear of anyone giving something you think that would be a good addition to the journal, please check out the submission guidelines on our website. And here's a reminder about the new AIIS website that Russ mentioned earlier. Oh, these are going to the waiting room somehow. That wasn't supposed to happen. There. And also a reminder to save the date. Again, we'll send this out via email, but April 9th, we will it's a Friday. We are planning to have another gathering focused on interreligious education at the high school and college levels. And am I forgetting anything, Axel or Mary Elizabeth? That
A thank you to Tom for all of the behind the scenes work, daily, weekly, monthly, and today. And also a thank you to Mary Elizabeth, who is retiring soon from being the Dean of the BU School of Theology. And she will join our board of advisors. So we're not letting her slip away. But Luis before talked about the importance of genealogies, and genealogies, I think, in this field are also important. And there were many people that came before us. And Mary Elizabeth, you were experimenting and mucking around and urging and envisioning long before many of us came on the scene. So thank you for decades of work and for your generosity and collegiality. And we look forward to working with you in a different capacity.
I am so grateful to this community, and I mean everybody who's gathered here. This represents the kind of invisible community that share these deep concerns in thousands of different ways. So it's a great privilege to be part of it in some small way.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. It was great. Really appreciate it.
Be well, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you.